I noticed this one little girl because she was holding this balloon between her forearm and her waist. And then I looked, I realized she had no hands. And I asked the nun, what was happening? She, oh, very bad. The VC come through the village and asking for rice from the family. They had none to give them. So they take the baby and they cut her hands off. So then we have the little baby. And I have her picture. I've had it in my house for 50 years now. I look at her every day. And one of my missions is to hope to see if I can find out what happened to her. But, it's been very difficult because we were concerned that maybe I was hoping so much she may have been taken out on the baby lifts that we had. And Sok Trang, what they told me is typically they didn't get children that far from there. But then I've since recently found out that it's a good possibility that she might have had a chance.
Debbie Moore volunteered for 2 tours in Vietnam and spent 50 years searching for a little girl whose hands were cut off by the Viet Cong. And I mean, when you hear this story, you'll understand why that child's face has stayed with her every single day since 1968. Debbie Moore wasn't a combat soldier. She was a young American woman who went to Vietnam to serve in a different capacity, working with the troops, connecting with local communities. And what she witnessed there changed her entire life. This is the kind of story that doesn't always get told, the experiences of the women who served, the moments that happened away from the firefights but were every bit as impactful in their own way. Moore's story is about compassion in the middle of war, about the civilians caught in the crossfire, and about a promise she made to herself that she's still trying to keep half a century later. And look, before we get too deep into Debbie Moore's experience, I just want to mention that I share these veteran accounts because these voices matter. They really do. The men and women who served in Vietnam saw things that most of us can't imagine, and preserving their stories is important work. So if you care about keeping this history alive, maybe consider subscribing so you catch these stories when they come out. All right, let's get into what Debbie Moore experienced. Debbie Moore first arrived in Vietnam in late 1968, assigned to Sok Trang down in the Mekong Delta region. She was serving with the Special Services, which was the branch of the military responsible for morale and welfare activities for the troops. This wasn't a desk job back in the States, though. Moore was in country, in Vietnam, working directly with soldiers and with the local population. The Delta was one of the most contested areas of South Vietnam, a maze of rivers and rice paddies where the Viet Cong had deep roots among the population. American forces operated there alongside South Vietnamese troops, trying to secure villages and interdict enemy movement along the waterways. It was dangerous territory, and Moore knew that when she signed up. One of the things that made Debbie Moore's service distinctive was her connection to the Vietnamese people themselves. A lot of Americans in Vietnam, understandably focused on the military mission, didn't have much contact with civilians except in passing. But Moore developed what she describes as a deep attachment to the local nationals, particularly the children. At Sok Trang, Moore's unit adopted a local Catholic orphanage. This was part of a broader effort to build relationships between American forces and the communities they were supposedly protecting. Hearts and minds, as the phrase went. But for Debbie Moore, it wasn't just a program or a policy, it was personal. The orphanage became something she genuinely cared about, and the children there became real to her in a way that would mark her forever. The GIs at Sok Trang got involved too. Moore helped organize efforts to get the soldiers connected with the orphans, and families back home started sending supplies. Little clothes, treats, toys, all the things that children need and that were so hard to come by in a war zone. The troops responded, and there was something healing about it, a chance to do something purely good in the middle of so much destruction. It reminded everyone the soldiers, and probably the children too, that there was still kindness in the world. One day, the orphanage brought a group of children to visit the American base. They came in the back of a deuce and a half, one of those big military trucks, with the nuns accompanying them. The kids sang and danced for the soldiers, and the GIs showered them with the gifts their families had sent from home. It was one of those moments that probably felt like a small miracle, a break from the war, a connection across cultures, children laughing in a place where there was usually so much fear. But during that visit, Debbie Moore noticed something that would haunt her for the next 50 years. There was a little girl, maybe 18 months to 2 years old, holding a balloon. And the way she was holding it caught Moore's attention. The child was pressing the balloon between her forearm and her waist. And then Moore looked closer and realized why. The little girl had no hands. Moore asked one of the nuns what had happened to the child. The answer was the kind of thing that makes you understand what this war really meant for the Vietnamese people caught in the middle of it. The Viet Cong had come through the girl's village, demanding rice from the families there. The child's family had none to give. They had nothing. And so the VC, to make an example, to terrorize the population into compliance, they took the baby and they cut her hands off. Just try to sit with that for a moment. A baby, maybe a year and a half old. And they cut her hands off because her family couldn't give them rice they didn't have. This is what the war looked like for Vietnamese civilians. Not abstract politics, not domino theories, but men with machetes mutilating infants to maintain control through fear. Debbie Moore stood there, a young American woman who had grown up in a sheltered, ordinary life, who had never been around violence, and she looked at this little girl with no hands, and something shifted inside her permanently. Moore has a photograph of that little girl. She's kept it in her home for over 50 years now. Every day, Debbie Moore looks at that picture. Every single day. The child's face is still there, frozen in time, still a toddler, still holding that balloon the only way she could. And Moore has never stopped wondering what happened to her. That's the thing about moments like this. They don't end when the moment ends. They stay with you. They become part of who you are. For Debbie Moore, that little girl without hands became a mission that has lasted her entire adult life. She wants to know what happened. Did the child survive the war? Did she make it out during the baby lifts, the evacuations that brought some Vietnamese orphans to America and other countries in the final days of Saigon? Is she alive somewhere, a woman now close to 60 years old, living with the scars of what was done to her as an infant? Moore has tried to find out. It's been incredibly difficult. The chaos of the war's end, the fall of Saigon in 1975, the destruction of records, the dispersal of refugees. All of it makes tracking one child from a small orphanage in the Mekong Delta nearly impossible. The people Moore contacted told her that typically children from that far south in the Delta weren't part of the major baby lift operations. The orphans who were evacuated mostly came from Saigon and the surrounding areas where the logistics were more feasible. But Moore has also heard more recently that there might be a chance that some children from more remote areas did make it out. The uncertainty is almost worse than knowing for sure. If you've been following this story and it's hitting you the way it's hitting me, I just want to take a second to say that this is exactly why we need to preserve these accounts. Debbie Moore's experience, that little girl's tragedy, these are things that shouldn't be forgotten. If you're finding value in these veteran stories, subscribing helps get them out to more people who care about this history. Okay, continuing with what Debbie Moore experienced. The math of it is stark. That little girl was about 18 months to 2 years old in late 1968. That means she'd be around 55 or 56 years old now, if she's still alive. Moore has thought about this a lot. If there's a Vietnamese woman out there, around that age, who has no hands, well, the chances are decent that it might be her baby, as Moore still calls her. Her baby. 55 years later, and that's still how Debbie Moore thinks of that child. It tells you something about the depth of the connection, about what that moment meant. Debbie Moore's first tour in Vietnam was transformative in ways that went beyond that one orphanage visit, though that was certainly the most searing memory. Working in the Delta, she saw the war up close. She saw what it was doing to the soldiers, young men barely out of their teens, dealing with things no one should have to deal with. And she saw what it was doing to the Vietnamese, people whose country had become a battlefield, whose villages were burned and rebuilt and burned again, whose children were orphaned, or worse. When Moore's first tour ended and she got orders to go to Korea, she could have taken the safe assignment. The woman running the Korea operation had a reputation for being strict about safety, keeping the personnel out of dangerous situations. No spontaneous helicopter rides, no wandering into villages, none of the risks that Moore had taken in Vietnam. But as Moore prepared to leave, she thought about her friends who hadn't made it home, the ones whose names would eventually end up on that black granite wall in Washington. And she made a decision that a lot of people probably wouldn't understand. She didn't want to go to Korea. She wanted to go back to Vietnam. So, Debbie Moore went to Washington, D.C. and got her orders changed. She volunteered for a second tour in country, knowing full well what she was getting into. That's the kind of person she was, and honestly, still is. But the Army had noticed that Moore had a tendency to take risks during her first tour. She'd snuck out on her 22nd birthday to watch an ARVN military insertion, Republic of Vietnam forces going into action. She'd gone into villages with local nationals, putting herself in dangerous situations. The brass was happy to have her back in country, they told her that, but they were sending her somewhere they thought would be safer. Moore ended up at a truck unit in Khe Sanh, on the coast north of the Delta. No more orphanage visits, no more village excursions, just 9 months at a transportation unit that didn't have the same kind of engagement with the local population. It was the Army's way of protecting her from herself, maybe, or maybe just covering their own liability. Either way, Debbie Moore finished her second tour in Vietnam, nearly 2 years total in a war zone, and came home carrying memories that would shape everything that followed. The experience of Vietnam, and specifically that encounter with the little girl without hands, became what Moore describes as the most life-changing event of her entire life. Before Vietnam, she'd been a young woman with an ordinary, sheltered background. No exposure to violence, no real understanding of what human beings were capable of doing to each other. After Vietnam, she was something else entirely, changed in ways that probably took years to fully understand. Vietnam affected everyone who went there, soldiers and support personnel alike. The war had a way of getting inside you and staying there. But Debbie Moore's particular wound was tied to that orphanage, to that little girl, to the image of a toddler holding a balloon with her forearms because she had no hands left to hold it with. That image has never faded for Moore, and she's made sure it hasn't by keeping the photograph visible in her home for half a century. The aftermath of Vietnam wasn't all darkness for Debbie Moore, though. She's clear about that. Had she not gone, she says, she wouldn't have the 2 wonderful children she has. The connections she made overseas led to her marriage, to a life that took her back to Asia, to experiences she never would have had otherwise. The war gave her things even as it took other things away. That's how it works sometimes. Trauma and growth aren't mutually exclusive. You can be wounded and still build a beautiful life. Debbie Moore did that. One of the most remarkable parts of Moore's story is what happened decades later. 45 years after Vietnam, she reconnected with someone from that time, a man she describes as an amazing, wonderful hero. She mentions him, talking about his children and wife, being honorable, being respected deeply by his men. The way she speaks about this reunion, it sounds like a gift, an unexpected blessing that came out of all those years of carrying the war with her. For Moore to describe herself as a young bride at 72, with the kind of warmth and humor she brings to it, tells you something about her spirit. The war didn't break her. It marked her, absolutely. But it didn't break her. That little girl with no hands, the one Debbie Moore has been searching for all these years, represents something beyond just one child's tragedy. She represents all the innocent victims of Vietnam. The civilians who got caught between armies, the families who had nothing but were punished anyway, the children who grew up in a world of incomprehensible violence. When the Viet Cong cut off that baby's hands, they weren't just hurting one family. They were terrorizing an entire community, sending a message about what would happen to anyone who couldn't or wouldn't cooperate. This was a deliberate strategy, and it's one of the reasons the war was so brutal for the Vietnamese population. The Viet Cong used terror tactics to maintain control, and American forces sometimes responded with their own forms of brutality. The civilians were squeezed from both sides. This doesn't excuse anything either side did, but it helps explain the context in which Debbie Moore encountered that little girl. The orphanage that Moore's unit adopted was full of children like her, kids who had lost parents or been injured or abandoned in the chaos of the war. The Catholic Church ran many of these orphanages throughout South Vietnam, providing what care they could with limited resources. The nuns who brought the children to see the American soldiers were doing their best to give these kids some semblance of normalcy, some moments of joy in the middle of everything. That visit, with the singing and dancing and gifts from American families, must have been such a bright spot for those children. And yet, it was also the occasion where Debbie Moore saw something that would haunt her forever. That's how Vietnam was. Joy and horror, sometimes in the same moment. You could watch children laugh and play, and then notice that one of them had been mutilated by guerrillas. The war didn't allow for clean separations between good moments and bad ones. Everything was mixed together. The experience fundamentally changed how Debbie Moore understood the world. Growing up in America, sheltered from violence, you can develop a kind of innocence about human nature. You might know intellectually that terrible things happen, but you don't really feel it in your bones until you see it with your own eyes. Moore saw it. She saw what people do to each other when ideology or power or fear takes over. She saw a baby with no hands, and she couldn't unsee it. That kind of experience doesn't integrate easily into normal life. Moore didn't become bitter or cynical, at least not from what we can tell from her account, but she did become someone who carries a weight that most people don't have to carry. The photograph of that little girl, kept visible for 50 years, is how Moore honors that weight. She doesn't let herself forget. She doesn't want to forget. Forgetting would feel like a betrayal. The search for that little girl has become almost a sacred mission for Debbie Moore. The chances of success are small. She knows that. Vietnam was chaotic during the war, and even more chaotic at the end. Records were destroyed, people were displaced, names were changed. A child who was 18 months old in 1968 would have had no memory of the orphanage or the Americans or any of it. If she survived, she grew up as a Vietnamese woman with a disability, facing all the challenges that would entail in a post-war society. She might be in Vietnam still, or she might have emigrated. She might have been one of the boat people who fled in the late 70s, or she might have stayed behind. She might be dead. Moore has to accept all these possibilities while still hoping for the best one. The baby lifts that Moore mentions were the operations in April 1975 in the final days of South Vietnam, when thousands of orphans were evacuated to the United States and other countries. Operation Baby Lift was the official name, and it brought out nearly 3,000 children in the last 2 weeks before Saigon fell. But the logistics of those evacuations were concentrated around Saigon. Getting children out from the Delta, from places like Soc Trang, would have been much more difficult. Still, some children from more remote areas did make it out through various channels, and Moore holds on to that possibility. If the little girl was evacuated, she might have grown up in America or Australia or France or any number of other countries that took in Vietnamese orphans. She might not even know she's Vietnamese, depending on how young she was when adopted. But she would still have no hands, and that distinctive characteristic is what Moore focuses on. A Vietnamese woman in her mid-50s with no hands. It's a specific enough description that if such a person exists and can be found, there's a chance to confirm the connection. Moore has apparently made inquiries, worked with organizations, done what she can. The search continues even now. Debbie Moore's willingness to share this story is part of her larger effort to honor what she experienced in Vietnam. Like many veterans, she's found that talking about it, painful as it can be, is better than keeping it bottled up. The women who served in Vietnam have often been overlooked in the larger narrative of the war. Most people, when they think of Vietnam veterans, picture combat soldiers, men who carried rifles through the jungle. But thousands of women served in Vietnam too, as nurses, as Red Cross volunteers, as personnel in various support roles like the one Debbie Moore held. These women saw trauma of a different kind, often involving the wounded and the dying, the aftermath of battles rather than the battles themselves. They saw what bullets and shrapnel and burns did to human bodies, and they saw what the war did to civilians like that little girl in the orphanage. Moore's second tour, at the truck unit in Quy Nhon, was less eventful from what she describes, though being anywhere in Vietnam during the war was inherently dangerous. Quy Nhon was a major logistics hub on the coast, handling supplies and equipment for forces operating in the Central Highlands and elsewhere. The port there was critical to the American war effort, but for Debbie Moore, kept away from the kind of direct community engagement she'd had in the Delta, those 9 months must have felt different. Less intense, perhaps, but also less meaningful in some ways. She'd gone back to Vietnam specifically because she wanted to be there, wanted to continue the work she'd been doing, and instead, she found herself in a more restricted role. Still, she completed her service. 2 tours in a war zone, voluntary service, experiencing things that would stay with her for the rest of her life. Debbie Moore came home, like so many Vietnam veterans, to a country that didn't really know what to do with her. The reception for returning veterans in that era was famously difficult, with many experiencing hostility or indifference. For women veterans, there was often the additional challenge of not being recognized as veterans at all. People didn't expect women to have served in Vietnam, didn't think of them when they thought about the war. Moore had to integrate her experiences into a life that most people couldn't understand or relate to. The years since Vietnam have given Debbie Moore time to process what she went through, though processing is probably an ongoing thing, rather than something you complete and move past. The search for the little girl continues. The photograph stays on the wall. The memories don't fade the way ordinary memories do, and Moore has found ways to use her experience, to share it, to help others understand what the war was really like for those who were there. The reunion she mentions, the reconnection with that honorable man she knew from Vietnam suggests that the bonds forged in war can persist across decades. Veterans find each other, recognize something in each other that civilians can't see, share a vocabulary of experience that doesn't need explanation. For Moore to describe this reunion as a gift, a huge gift, shows that Vietnam gave her things even as it took things away. The relationships formed in that crucible, tested by shared danger and trauma, can be among the deepest relationships people ever have. We're getting near the end of Debbie Moore's story now, and I want to take a moment to thank you for sticking with it. These accounts take time to tell properly, and the fact that you're still here listening means you understand why it matters. If you want to help these veteran voices reach more people, subscribing and sharing these stories really does make a difference. This is history that deserves to be remembered, and every person who listens and passes it on is helping to keep it alive. All right, wrapping up Debbie Moore's experience. What stays with you from Debbie Moore's story is that photograph. 50 years and counting, and she looks at it every day. That little girl with no hands, holding a balloon the only way she could, has become a permanent part of Moore's daily existence. It's not wallowing in the past. It's not being stuck in trauma. It's a deliberate choice to remember, to honor, to keep searching even when the odds are against ever finding answers. That's a particular kind of strength. The strength to stay connected to something painful because the alternative, forgetting, would be worse. Debbie Moore went to Vietnam as a young woman seeking adventure and purpose. She found both, along with things she never expected and never wanted. The orphanage in the Delta, the children who sang and danced for the soldiers, the little girl whose family couldn't give rice to the Viet Cong. These images and experiences became the foundation of who Moore would become. Vietnam changed her, as she says, more than any other event in her life. It gave her children and experiences, and eventually, decades later, a reconnection with someone meaningful from that time. But it also gave her that photograph, that daily reminder of what human beings can do to innocent children in the name of war. Debbie Moore has carried both the gifts and the wounds for more than half a century now. She's spoken about her experience with clarity and emotion, helping others understand what the war meant for those who lived through it. The search for the little girl continues, and maybe one day it will succeed. Maybe somewhere there's a Vietnamese woman around 60 years old who was once a baby in a Catholic orphanage in the Mekong Delta, who lost her hands to violence she was too young to understand, and who has lived her whole life not knowing that an American woman has been looking for her, has kept her photograph all these years, has never forgotten. That's the hope that Debbie Moore holds on to. And whether or not that hope is ever fulfilled, the holding on to it means something. It means that what happened to that little girl matters, that she isn't just a forgotten casualty of a war that most Americans would rather not think about anymore. She matters to Debbie Moore, and through Moore's telling of this story, she matters to everyone who hears it. The Vietnam War produced millions of stories like this, moments of horror and moments of connection, lives destroyed and lives transformed. We can't know all of them. We can only listen when veterans like Debbie Moore are willing to share and make sure their voices reach as many people as possible. That little girl deserved better than what happened to her. Her family deserved better. All the children in that orphanage deserved better. And Debbie Moore has spent 50 years trying to give them the only thing she can, which is remembrance. She keeps the photograph. She tells the story. She searches for answers that may never come. That's what you do when you've witnessed something you can't unsee. You honor it by not looking away. Debbie Moore hasn't looked away for 50 years, and she's not going to start now. This was the story of Debbie Moore, a young American woman who served 2 tours in Vietnam and has spent half a century searching for a little girl whose hands were cut off by the Viet Cong. Thanks for listening.